December 20th, 2025 didn't arrive with sirens or headlines, but something shifted anyway. Overnight, the tone around the Diddy case changed in a way people who follow this closely immediately recognized. Not louder. Quieter. Not reactive. Intentional. When stories stop moving fast and start moving carefully, it usually means decisions are being shaped out of public view. Legal observers noticed it first. Language tightening. References reappearing. Timelines being re-examined that were supposed to be finished. This wasn't rumor energy. This was structure coming back into focus. And when structure returns, outcomes stop being hypothetical. Before we go any further, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. That's how you stay ahead when stories move quietly before they move publicly. Now back to what's unfolding. What makes this moment different isn't a new clip or a dramatic reveal. It's alignment. Material that surfaced separately over months is no longer being discussed in isolation. Footage, testimony, records, and timelines are being read together. That's a turning point most people miss because it doesn't trend. It consolidates. And consolidation is what systems wait for before they act. Over the past 48 hours, the language around the case has shifted noticeably. Not from commentators, but from people who usually don't speak unless something has changed. Statements slowed. Responses became narrower. The confidence that once surrounded public positioning softened into caution. That kind of restraint doesn't come from certainty. It comes from exposure risk. What's happening now isn't driven by outrage or online pressure. It's driven by consistency. When independent material starts pointing in the same direction without coordination, denial stops working as a strategy. At that stage, silence isn't avoidance. It's preparation. Behind the scenes, attention has reportedly moved away from debating narratives and toward reviewing overlap. What matches? What repeats? What can no longer be explained away as coincidence? This is the phase where systems stop asking if something looks bad and start asking what happens if it's ignored. And that question changes everything. The reason this matters right now is timing. December is when decisions get positioned quietly for what comes next. Not announced. Positioned. When reviews restart this late in the year, it's rarely symbolic. It's procedural. And procedural movement doesn't reverse easily. What's also telling is who isn't speaking. Silence from people who once filled space quickly. No counter-narratives. No confident dismissals. Just absence. And in moments like this, absence communicates more than statements ever could. Because when ground feels stable, people defend it. When it doesn't, they reassess. This story isn't accelerating. It's tightening. And tightening stories don't explode randomly. They resolve deliberately. What's unfolding now suggests the frame around this case is no longer the same one it started with. The lens has changed. And once that happens, outcomes stop being shaped by opinion and start being shaped by obligation. This isn't the reckoning itself. It's the moment before it becomes unavoidable. As attention narrowed, the focus shifted away from what people were saying publicly and toward what was being compared privately. This is where stories either fall apart or lock into place. And right now, the movement suggests locking, not collapsing. What stood out to observers wasn't a single new detail, but how older material began to behave differently once it was placed side by side. Separate pieces that once felt disconnected started lining up in ways that were harder to dismiss. Not perfectly. Not theatrically. But consistently. Footage that had circulated years apart began matching locations described in testimony. Time frames mentioned casually in interviews began aligning with documented schedules. Statements that once sounded vague suddenly gained clarity when viewed against records that already existed. None of this happened in public. It didn't need to. This is the kind of alignment that doesn't require explanation because it explains itself once seen. What unsettled analysts most was how little interpretation was needed. When evidence requires heavy framing, it's fragile. When it holds without commentary, it's durable. And durability is what triggers the next phase. This is when material stops being treated as content and starts being treated as reference. The difference matters. Over the past day, the tone around the case has reflected that shift. Conversations became narrower. Questions became more specific. Instead of asking what something means, the focus moved to when it happened, who else was present, and what followed immediately after. That's a procedural lens, not a cultural one. It's the lens used when credibility is being weighed, not debated. Another signal came from how quickly speculation gave way to restraint. Public voices that once spoke freely grew measured. Words were chosen carefully. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying the wrong thing now carries weight. When stakes rise, noise drops. That pattern shows up again and again in cases that move from visibility to evaluation. What's also important is what hasn't happened. There's been no rush to discredit everything at once. No sweeping dismissal. That approach usually appears when confidence is high. Instead, responses have been selective, cautious, almost surgical. That suggests awareness of where pressure actually exists. And pressure doesn't come from volume. It comes from overlap. Behind closed doors, attention is reportedly centered on scope. Not whether review is justified but how broad it needs to be. That distinction matters. When the question becomes how far instead of whether, the trajectory changes. At that point, containment stops being an option and management becomes the goal. This phase is uncomfortable because it lacks spectacle. There's no moment to clip, no soundbite to replay. Just quiet recalibration. But historically, this is where outcomes are shaped. When institutions slow down, it's not hesitation. It's control. They're measuring consequences before committing to direction. What's emerging now is a sense that the original frame around this story may no longer hold. What was once viewed as isolated incidents is being reconsidered as part of a broader sequence. And sequences demand explanation in ways single moments do not. Once that shift happens, the burden changes. It's no longer on observers to prove concern. It's on decision-makers to justify inaction. None of this means conclusions have been reached. But it does mean the margin for dismissal has narrowed significantly. When multiple elements begin reinforcing each other without coordination, skepticism weakens. Not because people want a particular outcome, but because patterns don't negotiate. The next movement won't be loud. It won't arrive through leaks or dramatic announcements. It will appear as procedural steps that only stand out if you know what to look for. Requests revisited. Materials re-examined. Conversations scheduled that weren't scheduled before. Those are the signals that matter now. At this stage, the story isn't building toward a reveal. It's moving toward a decision point. And decision points don't announce themselves early. They arrive once momentum has already made turning back impractical. By this point, the shift was no longer subtle. It was structural. What had begun as public attention was now being processed as material with consequences attached to it. And when that happens, the center of gravity moves away from opinion entirely. It moves into rooms where reactions don't matter, only consistency does. People close to the situation began noticing how quickly the conversation narrowed. Broad questions disappeared. No one was asking whether something felt right or wrong anymore. The focus turned to sequence. Order. Timing. What happened first, what followed, and what changed immediately afterward. That's not how culture debates stories. That's how systems evaluate exposure. One of the most telling signs was how older information resurfaced without being reframed. Reports that had once been dismissed as incomplete were now being reread alongside newly visible material. Not to revive old arguments but to test alignment. And the alignment was uncomfortable. Details that once seemed inconclusive began to feel contextual instead. Not explosive on their own, but difficult to ignore when viewed as part of a pattern. Observers pointed out something else that mattered. The absence of contradiction. Not silence, but a lack of credible counterstructure. No alternative timeline that held. No explanation that reassembled the pieces in a cleaner way. When that happens, doubt doesn't disappear instantly, but it loses momentum. Because doubt needs friction. And right now, the friction is minimal. This is also where the tone of coverage changed again. Media outlets stopped leading with reaction and started leading with chronology. Words like impact and fallout were replaced by review, assessment, and scope. Those aren't emotional terms. They're procedural. They signal that what's happening is no longer being treated as commentary. Behind the scenes, attention reportedly turned to responsibility. Not personal, institutional. When material becomes this visible and this interconnected, the question isn't just what happened. It's who had a duty to notice earlier and didn't. That question carries weight far beyond any individual. It touches systems, oversight, and precedent. And that's when things accelerate quietly. Another detail stood out to analysts watching closely. The timing. Not of the release but of the response. Movements that typically take weeks appeared to compress into days. Requests that normally sit idle were revisited. Lines of communication that had gone cold reopened. That doesn't happen because of public pressure alone. It happens when risk calculations change. What's driving that recalculation is not outrage. It's redundancy. The same themes appearing independently across different formats. Footage matching testimony. Testimony aligning with records. Records fitting timelines that already exist. When redundancy appears, dismissal becomes expensive. And systems are designed to avoid expensive mistakes. At this stage, people familiar with similar cases describe it as the narrowing tunnel. Options reduce. Paths forward become clearer, even if they aren't yet public. The range of outcomes shrinks, not because decisions have been made, but because certain decisions are no longer viable. Importantly, none of this requires a dramatic trigger. There's no single moment that flips a switch. It's cumulative. Each aligned detail adds pressure. Each unanswered overlap tightens the frame. Until eventually, doing nothing looks less defensible than doing something. This is also when language becomes careful. Statements, if made at all, avoid absolutes. They lean on process, on patience, on review. That's not confidence. That's preparation. It's an acknowledgement that the next phase won't be shaped by soundbites, but by findings. For viewers, this part of the story can feel quiet, even anticlimactic. But historically, this is where outcomes are decided. Not in the moments everyone clips and shares, but in the stretches where attention fades and work begins. Where files are compared. Where timelines are tested. Where credibility is weighed without an audience. What's clear now is that the story has crossed another threshold. It's no longer sustained by momentum alone. It's being carried by structure. And once structure takes over, direction becomes harder to reverse. The next developments won't arrive as spectacle. They'll surface as confirmation that the process has moved forward. And by the time that becomes obvious to everyone, the most important decisions will already be in motion. At this point, there's no room left for interpretation. The story has moved beyond reaction and into consequence. What once felt like public debate has narrowed into quiet decision-making, the kind that doesn't need headlines to carry weight. When material reaches this level of alignment, silence stops being protection and delay stops being strategy. What matters now isn't who's speaking, but what's being reviewed behind closed doors. That's where outcomes are shaped, long before anyone is told what they are. To the outside world, it may feel like the story has slowed. But this is the most decisive stage. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just irreversible. Systems don't rush when they reach this point. They move carefully because they understand what's at stake. Whatever comes next won't feel sudden. It will feel inevitable. Because the reckoning didn't arrive in one moment. It arrived through accumulation. And once that threshold is crossed, there is no returning to uncertainty, no resetting the narrative, no way back to how things were.